This episode of the Police One podcast is sponsored by Officer Store. Learn more about getting the gear you need at prices you can afford by visiting officerstore.com. Hey, welcome back to Policing Matters on policeone.com. I'm Jim Dudley, and we have a special election show with the upcoming election. So many issues around your city, county, state, and of course, nationally, with our leader in the White House being elected. And what would happen depending on who? I'm not even mentioning names, but depending on who gets in the big chair at the White House, what could the implications be on law enforcement? Well, we're talking about key issues today, ranging from drug cartels, ghost guns, crime issues, immigration, court rulings, and others as they impact law enforcement. And who better to talk to than today's guest? With the election soon upon us, several law enforcement issues may be affected by whoever wins across America. And today I'm speaking with Terrence Dwyer, retired from the New York State Police Department after a 22-year career as a trooper and investigator. He's now a tenured professor in the Justice and Law Administration Department at Western Connecticut State University, and he's an attorney in private practice representing law enforcement officers in disciplinary cases, critical incidents, and employment matters. He is the author of Homeland Security Law, Issues and Analysis from Conella Publishing, and we have a link and a picture of the book cover in the back, one of several that he's written. Hey, welcome back to Policing Matters, Terrence Dwyer.
Thank you. Thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the show again. This time we're going to talk about some real issues, substantive issues that may be in the balance of change depending on the outcome of the 2024 election here in the U.S. Well, crime issues should be our number one topic. Overall, what could or what would one party or the other do to address crime issues in America? And, I think part of the problem is we don't have really accurate reporting. And of course, the pundits make hay over saying crime is up or crime is down. Shouldn't we start by fixing the FBI uniform crime reports and the NIBRS reporting system, neither of which is compulsory? I get that. But our crime statistics vary depending on the source. Could financial incentives or mandates be tied to mandatory reporting by departments? Why aren't we reporting mandatorily?
Yeah, good question. First, to start off, every election cycle, there are two issues that seem to always be at the top of the public's concern, and that is the economy, which is number one, and always following close behind is crime. And this election cycle is no different. Polls show that, of course, it's the economy. First, it was inflation that seems to be going down, but overall the economy, and then the crime issues. Interestingly enough, there was a study that was done regarding public perception of crime, and actually, the study found that the public kind of got it right. So just intuitively, they were pretty close to most of the issues that are out there. Regarding the UCR and NIBRS, I believe I'm a firm believer in the old Samuel Johnson quote: "The three types of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics." You know, any one of these reporting systems are only as good as the data that's fed into them. NIBRS is supposed to be a better system, a more accurate view of crime, not a summary crime report like the UCR. But as you mentioned, the reporting is an issue. It's not mandatory. That we've switched to NIBRS in January 2021. The FBI's UCR unit is pushing the NIBRS system, but there's problems as far as reporting. Most of the big cities are reporting. They have the resources, they have the funding. Interestingly enough, NYPD is still not totally on the NIBRS system, but they're working on it, or they may actually by now. but the big departments are doing it. It's the smaller departments, and that becomes a funding issue, that becomes a personnel issue, that becomes a training issue, that becomes a technology issue. Uh, Financial incentives, sure, but in that regard, it's not so much reward you for doing it. I believe sanction you for not doing it. That would seem to be, if you're talking about anything in the terms of financial. But the government, if you want an accurate reporting system, has to help those smaller agencies that don't have the funding. And let's face it, I know we're going to be talking about it later, but we're short-staffed out there right now. Departments are straining to fill shifts. Their officers, from what I've heard and talked to, students I teach that are now out in the field, they're tired. They're tired. They're putting in 80-hour weeks. Some of them just with overtime, and that's not sustainable. So then to add on to that, hey, by the way, you have to report, and here's our reporting system, and here's the different categories, and here's how it has to be separated and everything else. That becomes a pretty heavy burden. NIBRS is more accurate and will give us a better view of crime statistics. But again, you've heard the term juking the stats. The stats can always be, and we've had in the past under the UCR, we've had issues with major departments and well-known police executives that were caught in juking the stats, lowering the crime. Big cities don't want high crime rates because they're not going to get the conventions, they're not going to get the tourists. But again, the American public knows just intuitively. Every cop out there knows from experience what the crime rate is. You just ask any cop in their patrol area. They know, they could tell you. They don't need the statistics. They're the ones going to the calls. I had a former student in my office today, not today, last week, I'm sorry. Shift supervisor in a municipal department. Says he goes into work, and on any evening on the 2 shift, the 4 to 12, he's already 70 calls backed up for his people.
Wow.
So, and this is not a major city. This is maybe a mid-sized, smaller city on the East Coast. So, departments are stretched thin as it is. So, we have to find a way for them to get the funding, to get the training, to get the technological infrastructure if they don't have it to accurately report. And then what those statistics tell us drives policing strategies and so many other things that law enforcement deals with out there.
Yeah, and I mean, I tell my own students that the probably the best indicators of crime stats are homicides and robberies, probably most reported. Of course, homicides, there's usually a body attached to it.
Yeah,
But so those
but that
numbers.
even yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, no, no. I was just saying that even those numbers across reporting systems, I mean, after 2020, we thought that maybe homicide was down, but then we looked at some of the biggest reporters, I think Chicago, LA, and New Orleans, some of the cities with highest or higher numbers of homicides still hadn't reported to the system. So we got to take those even with a grain of salt. Every statistic, like you said, should have an asterisk with a little explanation, maybe a paragraph
Yeah,
underneath of which major cities didn't report. There's that old example that says if we took 7 of our highest reporting homicide cities, that we would drop from number 2 or 3 in the world down to in the close to 100 down on the list. So those are significant numbers.
sure, absolutely. And how homicides get reported has changed from the UCR to the NIBRS system because under the UCR, a justifiable homicide still gets recorded as a homicide, where under the NIBRS system, it doesn't. So if you have a homeowner shoots an intruder in their home and it's justifiable, it's still going to get counted as a homicide. So that's going to skew the numbers. I mean, not significantly, but still it's gonna impact. So the NIBRS system is going to be more accurate. But you're correct. Look, you ask the American public what are the major crime concerns, and we know it's violent crime and it's gun crime. Anything you read, gun violence and violent crime in general is up there. and fentanyl. The fentanyl crisis is out of control, and then the organized crime situation. Transnational organized crime. Organized crime has changed from my days working in New York City, chasing 4 to 5 crime families in the traditional mafia structure, and then going a little bit into some of the back then the up and coming the Russian organized crimes influence and some of the drug groups, major drug groups. But I mean, transnational crime has changed, and I think the whole um, kind of overview of it and what we're dealing with in the country is markedly different from, many years ago, back in the 90s when I was working in New York City doing, mob cases.
Yeah, for sure. And we will get to gangs and we'll get to the drug issues, especially when we talk about, again, with the upcoming election, some of the social experiments are being voted on. And we've seen Oregon pull the trigger backwards from 2020 when they essentially legalized drugs in the state of Oregon. They saw what a disaster that was. In just January of 2024, they voted to repeal it. We've here in the West Coast in California, we've got some similar ballot measures that might peel back or at least modify some of those decriminalization legislations. But immigration. Now, we know that the border is porous. The recent declines of numbers coming into America has reportedly been lessened. But did we just change the terminology by adding, the quote, TPS or the temporary protected status or otherwise other asylum sanctions to reduce the numbers? I just read this last week that assault cases against border agents, border patrol agents, are just coming to fruition now, that they're prosecuting people who have assaulted border patrol agents at our southern border. Uh, can we expect anything different with the upcoming elections?
Well, I mean, let's first start with immigration. Every country has a right to protect its borders. I write about that in my book, Homeland Security Law. Uh, with that being said, though, there are certain other issues involved. We know it's not a simple issue, right? And you bring up temporary protected status. So let me address that. That's a designation given to individuals who are fleeing countries because they are war torn or because there's a natural disaster. And then also I want to bring up refugees because there in the past there have been restrictions on refugees. We're a signatory to the 1967 protocol that supplemented the 1951 Convention on Refugees, international law. We're signatory to that. Not only that, we have Public Law 96-12 from March 17th, 1980. So our own domestic law says that we have to take in refugees, and we are, I think last I checked, this was a while ago, but we were one of the leaders in the world as far as opening our doors to refugees. And we can point to many individuals that are here because their families are escaping persecution somewhere in some country. Most of us are, I mean, I'm second generation. My wife is first generation, Ireland. My grandfather came here escaping issues in Ireland in the early part of the 20th century. I have students whose families are, have escaped things in Eastern Europe and in Central America. But you don't get temporary protected status unless you meet specific legal requirements. If you're convicted of a felony, you're not going to get TPS. If you're not a national of the nation you're claiming TPS from, you're not going to get it. And also, if you're not from one of those nations that are listed, I have a list in front of me of the nations. They go from Afghanistan to Burma, Myanmar, Cameroon, all the way down to Ukraine, Venezuela, and Yemen. All right. So there's a list of countries. And you have to meet those specific protocols. The problems that we're encountering and the crime problems I believe that we're encountering is the ones that always, the getaways, the ones that got away. You talk to Border Patrol agents and they're going to tell you, yeah, For every one we get, how many get across? For every fentanyl seizure or drug seizure, how many get across? I mean, that's been the drug game for years, the war on drugs. I came up on the job during the war on drugs. I remember when crack came out. I remember when it hit the street. I remember being a young uniformed trooper. We patrolled a municipal area, pretty suburban, heavy, densely populated area, not right outside New York City, and crack was everywhere. Uh, it's changed. The whole drug um, importation has changed. The cartels, we're dealing with two major cartels out of Mexico, the Sinaloa cartel and I can't think of the name, Jalisco hotel cartel. They're sophisticated. They've got more money than the government is throwing at the problem, and they've also have access to personnel. They can replenish personnel. They're one of the major employers, and they're training their people. They're training them in counter surveillance. They're training them in a lot of techniques. So our border patrol agents are facing quite a daunting task. Our police agencies at the borders are facing quite a daunting task with the flow of drugs over the border. And there are going to be people that say no. There's You can go back and forth on this issue. Most drugs are caught at the entry points, whatever. Most of the drugs are smuggled through entry points. I mean, sophisticated trafficking networks. We have to arm our people with the resources, with the technology to counter that. And we also have to do it through laws that restrict. The immigration scheme has been broken in this country for years. And I can just give a quick anecdote. Back in January 2001, I had an informant. I had a Middle Eastern informant, and I was doing recorded calls for 8 month period with all sorts of crimes in our patrol area as an investigator during that time. He was a Coptic Christian subject to a pogrom in his country back in Egypt. 9/11 happens, right? I get one of my targets locked up and in the federal facility, only to be on the verge of being released by a district judge who he bamboozled. And I had to go to the assistant U.S. attorney and keep him in. Meanwhile, I had to run down to Manhattan from a shift and testify at an immigration hearing. They were trying to throw out my informant out of the country, a registered New York State Police informant who was working with us, and some technical issues with his whole green card and everything else. But he was on the verge of being deported. Meanwhile, an individual I had arrested for felony offenses in the United States was getting ready to be released. And if it wasn't for me getting a very good assistant U.S. attorney and telling him what was going on, we were able to stop it. And my informant got it. And I realized back then the system is screwy. You're keeping the wrong people, you're throwing out the right people. And my informant now is a hardworking individual, a naturalized citizen, living the American dream, adding to the economy, doing quite well for himself, married with children and everything else. So the system has been broken for years. But I don't think the issues is maybe has been in changing, the designation TPS or whatever. These are people that are allowed to be here under our laws for stated reasons, and they have to meet these requirements. It's the ones that get away. It's the networks that are operating in our country. I mean, look, the Mexican cartels are operating in every major city, and they have individuals in every major city, and they easily go back and forth across the border. So I think we need to take border patrol agents away from maybe processing individuals to out there. And I think that's what the border patrol agents want. Let us do our jobs. Let us enforce the law, enforce the border protection, and maybe add more to the border patrol as far as personnel. But a nation has a right to protect its borders. Every nation has a right to protect its borders, and I think that's what gets lost in the conversation. Now, whether a wall is the answer or not, I mean, there is construction there. It's still not done, but I guarantee you, even if there's a wall, we're still going to have these problems. I did read an interesting article and it dealt with the issue in Mexico, and it did extensive studies, and it did this statistical analysis by a former Mexico police officer. It was one article, and then there was another article, but it said really the best way to weaken the cartels is to provide more jobs for individuals in the Mexican economy, because they're like
Mm,
the fifth largest employer or something like that. They're up there, which is great and it sounds good. The cynical part of me still says, hey, you know what, the cartels are going to be offering more money. So I don't know, but it's just an interesting analysis, because you are dealing with individuals in incredibly impoverished countries with high crime rates, high homicide rates, all across Central America, that are looking for work. They're looking for basic work needs to support their families. The cartels, at quite a risk, is offering that. There's a high reward but high risk in that line of business. But it's an issue that's been trying to be addressed for the last decade or more. I really don't know what the answer is, but certainly we cannot handcuff our own people that are charged with that enforcement responsibility. And the Border Patrol needs to be out doing their job, patrolling the borders, not processing individuals. But we're just overwhelmed at the borders in some areas. So it's above my pay grade as far as solution. But the thing with the temporary protected status and refugees, it's domestic law, it's international law. We're a signatory to certain treaties, so there's no end around with that. And I don't think it's any kind of evil, well, it's labeling them here, because most of the people here at TPS status are in communities where there is some support network, and there is a framework to help them. And I'll be honest, I've had some of those. I've had some of the children of those individuals in my classrooms, and one thing I can uniformly say is that by and large they've been wonderful students. They've been good, because we have a big um, population from Central America in our area, and different areas, very diverse area. But people just wanting to kind of get ahead, sort of deal. So it's interesting that we can point at refugees and temporary protected status, this and that, but it's really the criminals we have to focus on, and that's the thing, where the criminals are getting away. They're somehow getting through.
yeah, and I mean, going back to, you talk about Jalisco and Sinaloa and the drug cartels that are also getting their people up, probably not through the TPS, but the getaways, as you talk about. And we're trying to use these strategies of sending money back to their country of origin to say, stay here, don't come up. And it's kind of that similar strategy that we use with our own inner city drug dealers, saying, here's
Hmm.
a job at McDonald's for, $6 an hour, when you're making 1,000 or more, sitting stranded on a street corner for a couple hours.
Absolutely. And the one thing I learned when I was on the job and doing, I spent 17 and a half years as an investigator in the Bureau of Criminal Investigation. So, and I worked a large chunk of that doing organized crime cases, and then homicide cases on a major crime towards the end of my career. But one thing I noticed is that there's a large underground economy, a large underground economy. I mean, you just go into neighborhoods and you talk about local numbers games, the illegal gambling, and you just keep going up from that. So the legitimate economy has to compete with the underground economy. And there are many people that have existed in this country just based upon an underground economy, and it's not going to be taxed, and it's going to be more lucrative for them. And there's a lot of money out there, a lot of money out there.
Yeah, and we have our own built-in protections. Ironically, I was looking at the cover of your book, and it is a portion of the wall on our
Yeah,
southern border. But we have our own sanctuary cities in America. California is a sanctuary state, and some of the frustration by law enforcement officers has been, we have 3, 4, 5 strikers that remain in California despite being convicted of dealing drugs. And here we have a
yeah.
phenomenon of people being absolved of the crime if they can say that they were coerced into selling because their families are being threatened back home. which I don't believe the premise, because we offer no protection. We just let them walk, and there's no follow-up. So if that's a legitimate cause, then where's the mechanism to follow up and free their families back home, or get them, escort them back, whatever. But I don't, I'm as frustrated as you are, as the street cop is, in seeing some of these play out on the streets, where they're caught in the middle. The communities are saying, hey, stop these guys brazenly dealing dope on the corners. Um, Fentanyl, as you mentioned, is such a contributing factor to the malaise in cities, and our
Oh yeah.
climbing death rates, our overdose death rates. And the only tool on the police officer's belt these days in combating that crime is naloxone, or Narcan,
Yeah. The
to
Narcan.
to revive them back for another day. And could we expect anything to happen? I don't know, tariffs or controls from the chemicals that are suspected to be being brought in from China to South America to make the fentanyl to come back up through our southern border?
I mean, that's one means certainly. Honestly, I wouldn't be as, that's a whole policy issue and get into politics and everything else. And then there's separate issues with tariffs. You can go into the whole economic, is it good, is it bad, for us. But I always find that the criminal mind, criminal networks are ingenious.
They'll
They're
find a way.
adaptable.
They'll find a way.
I started my career working in the jails at Rikers Island, the Bronx House of Detention. I I was going to college at the time, finishing college, and I'm thinking, man, some of these guys are smarter than the people I'm sitting in class with, because the things that they would come up with, the things that they would do, they were just very inventive minds. They watch, they learn, they know how to get around the system, and no system is perfect. But um, I think when you deal with just crime in general, and you deal with the drug crisis, whether it be fentanyl, whether it be heroin, whether it be cocaine, crack, what we've dealt with in the past is that we're learning that you just can't have a solid police response. You need police community involvement. And you see major cities like Chicago, like Boston, that are doing that. And if you look at any of the police reforms that have come down, any of the suggestions, even if you look at the police leadership, they're embracing the community. Look, you can't just sit back and complain and point the finger at us. You need to be involved. And you've had some very good grassroots efforts. You've had very good cop and civilian networking and community engagement to go out there and try and alleviate some of these issues and some of these concerns. But sometimes I feel it's like, shoveling sand against the tide. It's just going to keep coming in, coming in, coming in. So can we limit it? Can we minimize it? Maybe it's through education. Certainly there was, the whole just say no to drugs, and maybe that didn't work, but we do have some studies that show that there's a generation now that seems to be less using certain types of drugs. Now there are other vices that they're using, but uh, so I don't know what the answer is overall to it. It's certainly easy to point to the problems, hard to point to the solutions. But as always, it's the police officer on the beat who's left to mop up so many messes. Yet the fingers always get pointed, and one day the police officer is the hero, the next day the police officers, the goat, the bad person. But they deal with these issues day in, day out in their communities. And whether you're talking major city communities or suburban or more rural communities, they're all impacted in one form or another. But it's a police officer that's left to deal with it, the mental health crisis,
Mhm.
the ubiquity of guns throughout the United States, the influx of drugs, a lot of different social issues. Who's at the front line there? It's the police officer, and they're getting taxed because, as I said before, mentally and physically, there's less of them out there. That
Yeah.
nobody's running to the job the way they used to.
Right. Yeah, and everybody loves to point the fingers at the cop because they are in uniform. They are the most visible form of government on the street. But I'd love to
Absolutely.
see others jump into the fray, like departments of public health. And I mean, look, we
And
turn
you
the
have that. You have that in some
yeah,
places.
in some places, but in back west here in California, the harm reduction strategy is not working. And we turn the car keys of the drug issues over to public health. And their strategy is, well, let's let them do it, but let's let them do it safely. And I don't get that at all. So we have this rush of legal, if you will, prescription drugs and illegal drugs coming up through the borders or manufactured here at home. And public health's response has been okay, but let's make it safe. Let's give them clean needles. Let's give them a
Mm.
safe place to do their drugs under medical supervision and then out the other door. And we saw, like I said, in Oregon, that that strategy does not work, that
Yeah.
nobody's getting fined, nobody's being coerced into treatment, nobody's even given drug education while they're being rehabbed or brought back to life. So
Right.
I'd love to see, the attorney general, rather than condemning police violence as a, horrible thing, turn your attention to the drug crisis and sanction or stop giving money to some of these cities and states that are opening the doors, providing vehicles to do the drugs.
Well, the problem I have with the harm reduction, as you mentioned, is the irony involved in that we'll give them the needles, let them do it safely, what have you. But meanwhile, we're going to point the finger and shame people for drinking that 64 ounce, Slurpee, and we're going to put in legislation, which I think New York City did under Bloomberg years ago, that you can't serve over a certain amount, and you can't smoke in these areas. And I'm not a smoker, and I'm not a fan of 64-inch Slurpees, but it's kind of funny the things that we choose to regulate,
Don't get me
and we
started.
tell.
We can't
Yeah,
even have
what
plastic
I'm just saying.
straws. Can't have plastic
Yeah.
straws in California, yet we're given glass straws and foil for meth and fentanyl people to smoke with.
Well, that's the irony, and I hate where there's inconsistency in thought patterns. But I can again, experiential wise, just go back to my patrol days. We had a methadone clinic outside one of our hospitals, and our patrol area was a big suburban area outside a municipal area, a very busy municipal area back in the time crack had just come out. And all the the methadone maintenance program, all they were doing was exchanging one drug for another. They were selling their methadone out on the street for crack. Uh, so again, yeah, we can go around and round chasing our tail with this one, but yeah, the irony always sticks out with me. We're bombarded nowadays with different drug commercials on TV, and all the side effects seem to be death if you're not careful. You cannot drink the big, sugary drinks, and don't smoke because it's bad for your health. A lot of mixed messaging coming out, and they're coming from the same place. They're coming from healthcare providers. So.
Yeah.
Um, and again, yeah, these are issues, policy issues that go beyond my my pay grade. But yeah, as a lawyer and as a practitioner and somebody who's dealt with these issues in uniform as an investigator in the past, yeah, the common sense sometimes seems to leave the room.
Yeah, and I really enjoy reading your articles because of that legal scrutiny that you give some of our policies. And when we talk about the judicial system, we've seen some, head turners from the Supreme Court over the last 2 years. We've heard both candidates discuss what they'll do with executive orders. And I mean, every president that I could think of has issued their share, and it seems to be
Oh yeah.
increasing, of executive orders, whether it's related to prosecutors, the Second Amendment, and other issues. How can that affect line officers? Do we actually see any of those high level executive orders filter down to making the job easier or safer for cops?
I mean, in a word, I'm going to say no. So let's just talk about the executive order. Yeah, they've been around for a long time. Their use has increased over the years. You can go online and look on the federal website and see who's issued the most. Roosevelt seems to be the modern president, FDR, who really seemed to write executive orders, and he considered the time and what was going on in the country. But all they are is an official document done by the executive branch, which allows the president to manage different portions of the federal government, specifically agencies within the federal branch, and they have to be published in the Federal Register, and they do have the force and effect of law once they are published. The problem is that presidents have in the past issued executive orders, and they've stepped beyond their Article 2 powers as president of the United States, as the chief executive. Back in the 70s, there was a historian, Arthur Schlesinger, and he wrote a book, and he coined the term the imperial presidency. And he was really writing about the Nixon White House and what was going on then with Watergate and everything. But he looked at a few presidential administrations. And what we've seen is really this idea of the imperial presidency. Every president has tried to assert more power than they have had in the past. And when they've done that, they've gotten slapped on the hand, either by Congress, who has the power to legislate, or by the Supreme Court. And the most glaring issue was in 1952 in a case called Youngstown Sheet and Tube versus Sawyer, where President Harry Truman sought to take over the steel mills, known as the steel mill seizure case. And there was a labor unrest. There was going to be a strike, and it was negotiations between the United Steelworkers and the mill owners. Long story short is that because we were at war in Korea and we needed munitions, he decided he was going to seize the steel mills. Well, if you're a steel mill owner, you're going to have an issue with that, right? You're taking over private property. So it resulted in a decision written by Justice Hugo Black, but it's a concurrence by Justice Robert Jackson, which is really the most quoted. And he developed a tripartite system of presidential power. So the president acts within the realm of his authority, and he's on firm ground when he acts with the express or implied authorization of Congress and what his office allows him under the Constitution. When he acts at his lowest is when there's neither. There's nothing from Congress saying, or the Constitution, that says the president has these powers to act. And then there's what Jackson calls a zone of twilight in the middle, where Congress has kind of remained silent and there's nothing expressed to be said. So clearly, Truman at that point acted outside of his boundaries. And there have been other cases, but if you look at the last few presidents, Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, they've all had executive orders that were challenged somewhere in the courts or in the Supreme Court. Biden
Yeah,
has had executive orders upheld and overturned. Trump has had executive orders upheld and overturned. It comes down to a question of, is it within their power as president? Biden, on the last one he had upheld, dealt with some rulemaking issues or something within an executive agency, and he was within his boundaries. But that same term, the court said, no, in this instance, you overstepped. Same thing with Trump when he was president. So they're really to regulate the federal government. I can't conceive of anything where a president would issue an executive order that's really going to impact the line officer. But it is an interesting discussion because we do get into a gray area where a president can push the envelope and almost in a way legislate. And again, we saw it with Obama and we saw it with Bush, the same thing. So, lots of times with election cycles, you hear a lot. You hear a lot of rhetoric. I remember one of the past presidential cycles, there was a lot about stop and frisk. And if I found a candidate that could have appropriately discussed Terry versus Ohio and stop and frisk, I would have been happy. You're talking mostly about lawyers educated at very fine law schools that were talking about an issue they did not have a grasp on. And they were
mhm.
referring to a case out of New York City that they didn't even know what the end result of that case was or the history of that case. So again, with executive orders, I think it's one of those things that gets thrown out there. The American public is largely unaware of the extent of executive orders and just say, "Oh, that seems like a good thing. Okay, great." But let's go back to basic grammar school or high school governance. Three branches of government, separation of powers. Federalist Papers talked about it, checks and balances. If the president oversteps the boundary line, Congress can come in, the courts can come in, and they have in the past. So I can't think of any scenario right now regarding that that's going to really affect police officers. I know you mentioned the Second Amendment, but even there, we have a case that's in front of the court now dealing with ghost guns. I'm sure you'll get to later, but yeah, I don't see it offhand.
Yeah, no, definitely we'll get to ghost guns because I'm thinking about, I love the fact you brought up, the three pillars of government, executive, judicial, and legislative, that do sort of look to each other to make sure we're all on the same page. I can only see executive orders as maybe expediting something that we just don't have time to address otherwise. And then, of course, over time, maybe the courts or Congress will take a look at it and say, yeah, maybe not. And I think in one of those cases recently, we've seen a horrific mass shootings, one in particular in Las Vegas, where uh, the murderer had bump stocks on some of his weapons. And, oh, I think within a couple of weeks, the bump stocks were taken off shelves. Commerce can regulate the sales of things. And so ATF, as an arm, came in and said, we no more bump stocks. They are hereby illegal. And recently the court looked at that and said, yeah, we didn't really have the authority to do that. So now bump stocks are back in sort of that unregulated state. And I think Congress will be looking at that down the road. But
Yeah,
I wouldn't say
and
hasty move, but the fact that we moved so quickly without thinking through all the levels probably hurt the policy.
yeah, and I think, look, if anything, the executive orders, if they're going to have any impact, it's going to be on federal law enforcement agencies, if anybody. But the Commerce Clause power that Congress has, it's a power of Congress, is an enumerated power, and under the Constitution is an extensive power. It was one of the foundations of the civil rights movement, using their Commerce Clause power. But it is also limited. It's not, a wide net that can be thrown out. There was some pullback with some cases in the 90s and the early 2000s, but then in another case, the court came back and kind of showed the muscle that the Commerce Clause does have. But yeah, can they regulate? What's the extent to which the agencies can regulate? And the executive orders really can only impact the executive agencies, the president's management of. And as I said earlier, every president since Washington, in some shape or form, and really kind of accelerated in the 20th century with Roosevelt, FDR on forward, has kind of said, I have more power. It's under my power to say that the law shall be faithfully executed. So it's a matter of interpretation. And now there's this theory of the unitary executive, and that's another theory. Some people say it's new, but it's not. It's been around for a while. But that wants to vest even more authority in the president. And you can get into legal discussions and arguments over this. That could be a whole other show, but it's not really on topic. But it's just one of these things that, again, how are they going to impact the line officer? How are they going to impact the person on the street? If I'm a police officer on patrol, I'm not worried about executive orders. I'm worried about my shift, my calls, and the support I'm going to get from administration, and then from the courts and from the prosecutors that are prosecuting those cases.
Yeah. And where am I going to get my coffee?
Yeah, my coffee. Yeah.
Hey, I'd like to talk about, you mentioned ghost guns. I'd like to talk about the impact of ghost guns, any kind of legislation. Recruitment, of course, huge issue. You mentioned it. And let's get back to that. But first, let me take a moment and thank our sponsor. Officer Store, equipping protectors with passion. That's how we operate, and it's how we live. We understand that having the right gear can mean the difference between life and death. Our goal is to get you the gear you need, when you need it, at prices you can afford. visit us at officerstore.com. And we're back, and I'm speaking with Terry Dwyer, retired from the New York State Police, professor, attorney, author. What else you got going on, Terry? What are you writing about these days?
Well, I have my article with police1.com on, police liability and litigation issues. Always try and get stuff that's out there for the officers and supervisors out there. And I'm working on revisions to a general market book I've been writing about my own career, but it's really more about the impact on the ones around us in a way. So
Nice.
hopefully I'll have that out by later next year.
Yeah, in addition to your laws on Homeland Security.
Right,
Good
my
read.
book that's out there, Homeland Security Law Issues and Analysis. It's a textbook, but it's also can be a general read book. It's not really your traditional textbook. That's through Cognella Publishing, and I'm happy we use it in our Homeland Security curriculum. A few universities have adopted it, and a few people have told me they've read it themselves. And I said, didn't put you to sleep, so okay, I'm happy.
Nice. Well, ghost guns or those made on 3D printers with no serial numbers, easy to assemble firearms have been addressed by both then President Trump and current President Biden in attempts to regulate or ban them. Can we expect anything to happen? Is there anything significant before the courts to
Oh
decide?
yeah,
Tell me about it.
yeah. I got the case right here. It was argued recently. It's Garland versus Vanderstock. It deals with the Gun Control Act of 1968. Ghost guns, again, those untraceable parts of those kit guns that are not serialized. Really no accountability. The issues become whether or not there was an individual gun owner complainant or plaintiff, and or maybe one or two, and then there were a couple of companies, gun companies or suppliers, and they challenged an ATF rule that was introduced in 2022 that dealt with these parts, saying that basically they have to be serialized now, just like they come under the definition of the term of a firearm. So the case was heard at a hearing before the U.S. Supreme Court, an oral argument. The Solicitor General of the United States, Elizabeth Prelogar, and the attorney, Mr. Patterson, for the other side. And interestingly enough, I was reading up on it, and it seems from everything I've read from the major coverage, the different outlets that have covered it across the board, looking at bipartisan approaches, is that it appears the court is leaning towards supporting the administration's order, their interpretation of the Gun Control Act. But we know things are always subject to change when you get into the chambers of the courts. But there seem to be right now, through oral arguments, some strong allies, Amy Coney Barrett and Chief Justice John Roberts, that will go the way of upholding the ATF ruling. And if that's the case, you're going to have Sotomayor, Jackson, and Kagan with that. So you would probably get a 5-4. That's prognostication. Who knows? Things can change, but it's the issue of whether or not these individual parts set out alone can be deemed to be a firearm, requiring manufacturers to serialize them. That's breaking it down in its simplest terms. It was a case out of the Fifth Circuit. The Fifth Circuit didn't get to rule on it because the Supreme Court decided to take it. There was an order out of the district court down there that basically said, no, they can't do that. The government can't do that. During the interim of the case, though, the administration went to the Supreme Court and asked if, well, can we just keep the enforcement of it in place during the pendency of the case? And the court said yes. So they thought it was an important enough issue to just keep the administration's restrictions in place. So there's been oral argument. It's been submitted. The justices have to go back and forth in chambers, and they'll, can change. Right now, it looks like it could be 5-4, could be 6-3, could flip the other way and go 5-4 the other way. So who knows? But that's the issue, and it really again comes down to separation of powers. Is the federal government, is the executive branch within its power? Is this federal agency within its power to make this interpretation? Does it come within the express provisions of the congressional legislation and the powers that were left to the agency? So it'll be interesting to see. Uh, Certainly, guns are a problem, and you can say guns are a problem when we talk about crime and still be pro Second Amendment. I'm pro Second Amendment, but guns are a problem. They're and just anecdotally, I look at all the officer involves throughout the country. I get the reports. I lecture on use of force. I'm on top of these issues. I'm talking to my students about these issues in class. The gun violence to me, again, just anecdotally, from what I'm seeing, what I'm reading, seems to be at a level that I don't recall in my day. It was there. It was out. Don't get me wrong. Made gun arrests, plenty of gun arrests. There were things out there, but it just seems that it's more prevalent. And individuals, and this may go towards our mental health crisis, are more willing to take shots at police. Now, again, we can look at the statistics. Is it as bad as the 70s? And no, absolutely not. We can look at those statistics, but there does seem to be some and more random assaults that we find against police officers that I don't recall reading about or hearing about.
Mm.
Media now is different and we get this instantaneously, but I cannot wake up any morning without having a feed through my phone and reading about a police officer that was shot at, or killed in the line of duty. We had a really bad spell up here in New York in back in April, and I know other parts of the country had some incidents. When I say we had a really bad spell, we had 3 officer fatalities throughout the state, but then in a short span of time. But then we also had 3 other incidents where officers were hurt, and a couple of other encounters. So it was a busy April. It was a busy April, and that's just one part of the country. Guns are a problem. We want lawful gun owners to have them and to enjoy their constitutional protections and their constitutional rights. But no right is absolute, as I tell my students, except really your First Amendment freedom to believe whatever you want religiously, right? But only gets limited when we look to act upon that. Uh, but there's always some regulation of rights. So speech, there's regulations on speech, and just like the court has said, there are. Scalia of all people, Scalia has said when he wrote the decision in DC versus Heller, this is not to say that there aren't legitimate restrictions that the government can put, common sense restrictions on gun ownership or Second Amendment rights. And we saw the court in cases after Heller and after McDonald versus City of Chicago refused to take cases because they said, no, let the circuit court decision stand, because yes, that municipality has a right to limit the sales of silencers or what have you.
Hmm. Yeah,
So
no,
I think
and
with ghost guns, we have to be concerned with the police officer out there.
sure, for sure. I mean, the ghost guns have been responsible for several assaults already this year on police officers because they're easy to dispose of, and you're right, no serial number. Um, and for the
And gun
record,
tracing is important. And gun tracing is important when we're
100%.
solving crimes, we're solving homicides. And you know that, I know that any cop out there who's investigated a homicide that's involved a firearm knows that.
Yeah. Hey, for the record, I am a believer in the Second Amendment as well. And I just believe that, gun laws being what they are, we have some of the strictest gun laws in New York, Illinois, and California. And yet, have we clamped down or controlled the use of firearms in illegal activities? No, really not to any degree more than some of the states with looser laws. Um, and so I want to talk a little bit about the red flag laws. And man, I've written articles on red flag laws and why we need them. I think the follow-up answer is we need to prosecute gangs with guns, robbers with guns, murderers with guns. But it seems like every politician is against the gun, but maybe not the person holding the gun, right? It's like a Seinfeld episode, right? We want to take the gun, but not the person holding the gun. Uh, red flag laws. Tell us a little bit about Supreme Court Barnes versus Felix, again, out of the Fifth Circuit Circuit Court, talking about about red flag laws and being able
Well, no,
to,
that Barnes is not red flag. Barnes is not a red
the
flag. That's
pre-seizure.
pre-seizure conduct. Yeah. Just real quickly on red flag laws. Presumptively there to let's get the school shooter ahead of time.
Yeah,
Let's get the domestic abuser ahead of time. Let's take away the guns in those domestic violence situations and everything else. The balance to that, the civil liberties part of it is that we also have to be careful to not deprive individuals of a property right, of a protection. I think red flag laws can be good, can be used, but like any law, can also be abused. I want to get the guns out of the individual, and I'm just giving the devil's advocate both sides argument,
sure.
out of that. But Barnes v. Felix, this is an interesting case now because this deals with a case out of the Fifth Circuit, and it deals with police pre-seizure conduct and assessing use of force. It's an issue I'm going to be presenting at with another retired police officer who now is a police practices expert, goes around the country testifying on cases. But so there's a split in the federal circuits. The Second Circuit is in a minority with the Fifth Circuit and some other circuits that we look at the moment of the use of force. We look at that window of the moment of use of force and the reasonableness of the officer's actions. There are other circuits like the Third Circuit in Pennsylvania that looks at the totality of the circumstances. So the term pre-seizure conduct, what is the officer's pre-seizure conduct leading up to that use of force? And that will come into the question of reasonableness. So the courts have an opportunity here to kind of solidify their circuit court decisions and make a uniform rule. This is an issue that came up in city of San Francisco versus Sheehan, use of force case. I'm sure you're familiar with that. And there was another case out of California. The court really didn't address the issue, but this issue is right on point, and the court has agreed. The court has accepted cert. They've granted cert, so they're going to review it. So it's going to get briefed. It's going to get presented. It's going to get argued before the court. That is going to be interesting to see where the court lands on that issue, because there's been a lot of, especially after the Ferguson Ferguson, but also George Floyd in Minneapolis, police reform during COVID, and a lot of articles about police use of force and the whole what's our legal standard? How do we judge the reasonable police officer? So Barnes v. Felix is going to answer that question for us and see where it comes down. And I believe it's a majority of courts follow the Second Circuit, Fifth Circuit, where kind of look at that moment before use of force, where others will step back and let's look, well, what preceded it? And essentially, was it officer created jeopardy? Did the officer put himself or herself in the line to then have to use force? And if so, then it's going to be unreasonable. So that's really going to be something to keep an eye on.
Yeah. Well, going back to the red flag laws just for a second, because I've heard so
Mm.
many officers comment that it is unconstitutional, and now we're going, up against these guys who have guns. Well, of course, that's part of the job. But as far as the red flag laws, the ones that I've seen that pass muster are the ones that say that, back to the Fourth Amendment, by oath or affirmation, the police officer swears out that there's good reason to take the guns. And you and I come from similar era where we would tell people, hey, until they commit this crime, there's really not much more we can do about it. So the red flag law steps into the point saying, yeah, all reasonable assumptions say this person is going to use that gun for something that's not going to be good. And I wrote an article about this young gal who idolized the shooters at uh, Columbine, dressed like them, wrote like them, asked if she could buy a shotgun in Colorado, if she could fly, and she was over 18. Uh, Took all these steps, actually flew to Colorado, actually bought a shotgun, and actually, once everybody mustered up to go after her, she was found a mile or two from the school, just on the eve of the one of the anniversaries with the gun. She killed herself. And so, why wait until that tragedy before we could do anything? I think if used correctly, and like you say, anything could be abused, but if used correctly, I think, we need the red flag laws.
Sure,
Right now,
if they're used correctly, if it if it devolves into something where like some domestics, like, well, he said, she said, back and forth, and very flimsy. We don't want that. It has to be
sure.
objectively credible evidence, affidavit, sure, and there has to be those red flags. There have to be certain indicators, and I believe there are instances where we're going to find that, where we're going to have that. Sometimes, though, just practically, if we look at that school shooting where the parents were charged, there were, right on the eve of it, there were all these red flags, and sometimes it just happens so quickly when you get to the point where, okay, now we have that actionable conduct that we can use, but we don't punish thought crime in this country. And again, as I tell my students in my criminal law class, we don't punish thought crime. The closest we get is when we talk about conspiracies or attempts. But even with an attempt, there are different criteria under the model penal code or the state codes to charge somebody with an attempt. So, yeah, useful, sure, has to be done constitutionally, like anything. But to broad base it, say, well, they're unconstitutional. Well, I wouldn't go that far.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, we are, gosh, I'm imposing on so much of your time. Thanks for coming on. I want to ask last thing about police hiring. I know we've got other issues that we had on the agenda, but police hiring affects us all, increasing the numbers. Cops are overworked, overstressed. You talked about that. I do see an uptick in some agencies having better success. We're going to be talking about it at IACP. Dr. Janae Gasparini, a fellow New Yorker,
Mm,
cop and professor. She and I got together and wrote Recruitment Retention of Gen Z Law
yes,
Enforcement Officers from
I saw
Blue
that. Good book.
360 Media. Thank you.
Yes.
Sorry, I had to plug the book.
No, it's good. It's good. It's needed, and I'm familiar with her. Familiar with her work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
she's awesome. Um, some of the strategies, I know, some of the agencies are throwing money at it. I see that Seattle just upped their ante from a 30,000 hiring bonus to a staggering $50,000 hiring bonus in with, some particular, um, benchmarks that you'd have to reach. We're headed in the right direction, I think. What can the government do to get more cops into the career?
There was a time when there were lines around the block going to take the tests when I was taking all the tests, where my brother and his friends, my brother's a few years younger than me, they couldn't get on because there was just so many people looking to get on, and then they finally did, and they had long, good careers. But now they're going out trying to find people to take the tests, and we've seen our numbers go down in our program as well. I think there are a few things. One, there's been the 30 by 30 initiative to get more women in policing. Historically, it's always been low. It's been about 11 to 12%. When I came on, it was about 8%. And in that time, it's only gone up, slightly. We have bigger representation in our big cities for women, but it's only still about 20%. Now, this is not to say, because there's some people out there like, well, we need to get the best qualified, not just get women. No, 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 that's not what I'm talking about. It's about getting more women interested, good qualified women onto the job, like anybody else, and meets all the standards. And there weren't a lot when I came on. I'm sure there weren't a lot when you came on, but they bring value. They bring other skill sets to the job. And I've worked with many. My supervisor in major crimes is somebody I worked with for nearly 10 years. Female supervisor is one of the best I had. They bring a lot. So to get, and there are about 400 departments that have signed on to the 30 by 30 initiative, but look at the women recruits. I see a lot of women in my classrooms that are female students are looking to go onto the job, but we have to make the job attractive. COVID took a big hit, and the George Floyd, what happened in Minneapolis, and his death, and then the police reform movement and all the negativity took a big hit, as did the defunding conversation. And a lot of people say, well, law enforcement isn't financially lucrative. Well, it can be. I mean, I have students that are out there making six figures, 3 years out of college. They're working for it, they're making overtime. But you know what? Their counterparts in some of the business programs where they go, they're not making as much and they're working as many hours as well. Different issues regarding the two jobs, but uh, I've talked to some of my students who've come back to me and they've only got 3 years on the job and already they've had it. We have to support our officers when they're on the job, and that's the thing. They're getting beaten down real quickly, and they're getting beaten down in two ways: operationally and organizationally. And
Mm.
you look at anything that deals with police officer stress, it looks at those two factors. And most cops can deal with the operational, but the organizational on top of that, we have to get better at supporting our police officers. We have to get better, and that goes to mental health and everything else, which we're getting there. And the more innovative police leaders are flying that flag, and physical well-being, but mental well-being as well. But policing is a calling. It's a calling like anything, and you really have to want the job. There doesn't seem to be as many people because of the negativity that's been around it, but also there have been studies that said, look, it's not just policing, it's in other areas, it's in other public sector jobs. They're not getting the numbers. Firefighters, sanitation, good jobs with good pay. Um, and then you also have a generation that's more in tune with their me time, if you will, or their downtime. They're more cognizant of their mental wellness and their overall wellness in terms of work. I don't, want to work to live. Um, they or live for my work. Just they want that downtime, and policing unfortunately doesn't give you that. Sometimes you are going to be working 50-hour weeks, 60, 80-hour or 80-hour weeks, and you're going to have a changing schedule. And you're going to be out in bad weather, you know, and there are people that are not going to like you. So it's I think it's part of the COVID-19, part of what happened in Minneapolis and the police reforms and the negativity defunding, but also just the general public sector employment is down across the board. We are rebounding. We are rebounding. People are realizing that, well, wait a minute, these are good paying jobs with good benefits. I tell my students, look, you can step into most jobs on the East Coast and you're going to be making high 60s, maybe mid 70s. But after 2 years on with overtime, you could be making 100,000. And then where can you go from there? I know some people on my old job that are making $200,000 and on other jobs, if not more. I know out in California they're making, of course, cost of living. You have to look at your local cost of living
Yeah.
as well. But the jobs are out there and you can have a good life. And as I always tell my students, just because you're a police officer doesn't mean you don't start feathering your nest for down the line. I see so many people from our generation, generations before us, that have gone on to do other things. They've used the skill set that they've learned from policing, and policing gives you some incredible skill sets. I think that's what we need to be telling our students that are out there: job security, benefits, management training, all these different skills, not just about driving a car real fast and shooting a gun and putting handcuffs on people. There are so many things. We ask police officers today to do a lot. They have to do a lot. They're social worker, they're community organizer, they're law enforcer, they're big brother, big sister. We ask a lot for our officers, and there's a skill set that you will learn in a 20, 25-year career that you can take into the private sector and a lucrative job. And meanwhile, the longer you go in law enforcement, it gets pretty good. It can get pretty well. But we have to get them in the door, and it seems we are starting to do that. But I think we have to maintain standards up too. We cannot let the hiring standards go down across the board, and that's what worries me with the incentives, and that's what worries me with the rush to kind of pull people in because we are so short staffed. Let's keep up the requirements. We want certain caliber.
Yeah, and we've seen a couple of examples of really awful situations come from those you know, shortcuts to hiring, and maybe we don't touch all the bases when we're clearing a background or doing a psych evaluation, things like that. I'm really glad you talked about the retention aspect and how important that is to keep the officers that we have. And we saw the impact of 2020. And I think you're right. We're just recovering now. People are starting to realize the defund movement equates with that spike in crime, and how the social experiments of doing less with police officers wasn't the best solution. And I think people are realizing that, and hopefully they're going to, use that to vote with in November. Hey, Terry Dwyer, retired from New York State Police, professor, author, attorney, these great articles on Police One, your
Thank you.
books. What do you got coming out?
I'm really interested in officer mental health, and I'm looking at the liability aspects of departments that don't. So I've been talking to some people in the field. Yeah, I'm interested in this Barnes case out of the U.S. Supreme Court, and looking at use of force issues, and any of the topics that come up. And I'm working on my revision for my general market book, so hopefully I'll get that done and get that out there. So
Yeah, well, look forward to hearing from you. Thanks for spending time, giving us the view from the bench, if you will, on some of these important issues that are going to be decided or maybe not come November. And hopefully we get some relief filtered down to the line officers. Thanks, Terry. Appreciate you.
pleasure. Always good being here, Jim. Take care.
All right. Hey, to our listeners and viewers, let me know what you think about today's discussion. What did we miss? I know we had some other topics on the chalkboard that we didn't get to, and would love to hear your comments. Drop me a line at policingmatters@policeone.com. policingmatters@policeone.com. Love to hear what you have to say. All right. Well, I hope you are doing well mentally, physically, and I hope the job's treating you okay. Take good care and stay safe. Hope to talk to you again real soon.